The gavel cracked, a sound as final and unforgiving as a rifle shot in the dead of night. It shattered the suffocating silence of the Redemption Creek courthouse, a raw timber structure that reeked of fear, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of impending doom. Abigail Foster stood in the defendant's box, her hands gripping the worn wooden rail, so tightly her knuckles were bleached white. Yet her face, pale beneath the light dusting of prairie grit, remained a stoic mask. The word guilty still echoed in her ears, a venomous whisper that had coiled around her heart and squeezed. She could almost feel it now, the coarse rasp of the hangman's rope against her skin, the sickening drop. Murmurs, like the rustle of unseen creatures in tall grass, slithered through the packed gallery. The jury, 12 grim-faced men, their eyes hard and averted, had sealed her fate. They wanted her hanged. Judge Alistair Hargrove, a man whose face seemed carved from worry and prairie wind, adjusted his spectacles, his gaze skittering away from hers. He cleared his throat, a dry, hesitant sound. "Abigail Foster," he began, his voice thin and trembling. "For the heinous crime of murder, this court sentences you to." The great double doors at the rear of the courtroom exploded inward, planks splintering, hinges screaming in protest, as if a cyclone had just struck. Every soul in that stifling room flinched. Every head snapped towards the sudden, violent intrusion. Sunlight, blinding and fierce, poured in, silhouetting a figure that commanded instant, absolute silence. He was tall, whip-lean, clad in well-worn buckskin and adorned with beads that caught the light. Dust from a long journey clung to him. His black hair, unbraided, fell past his shoulders, framing a face of sharp angles and piercing, obsidian eyes that seemed to see into the very souls of men. Kéyah. The name alone was a legend whispered in hushed tones across the territory. Navajo Outlaw, renegade, a phantom of the high mesas. He strode forward, his moccasins utterly silent on the rough-hewn floorboards, an ancient rifle cradled loosely in one arm. His presence filled the room, radiating an almost primal power. He stopped, his gaze sweeping over the judge, the stunned jury, and finally settling on Abigail with an intensity that made her breath catch. His voice, when it came, was low, yet it sliced through the petrified silence like a newly honed knife. "This woman," he declared, his eyes burning into Judge Hargrove's, "you will not harm her. She is Náhookos. She is sacred to my people." Abigail had drifted into Redemption Creek more than a year prior, a solitary figure stepping off the stagecoach with naught but a single, scuffed carpetbag and a profound quietness that wrapped around her like a well-worn shawl. Her age was a subject of quiet speculation. Somewhere between the fading bloom of youth and the onset of middle years, her face etched with the faint, silvered lines of old scars that spoke of a past she never uttered, a life endured before Redemption Creek, a chapter she kept resolutely closed. She'd acquired the small, somewhat dilapidated cabin at the very edge of the settlement, where the creek whispered through the willows and the vast, untamed territories of the Navajo stretched towards the blood-red horizon. Some townsfolk idly theorized she was a widow seeking solace. Others, more prone to suspicion, muttered she might be fleeing something or someone. Abigail volunteered no history, and Redemption Creek, a raw frontier town generally more preoccupied with the daily struggle for existence than the antecedents of a quiet newcomer, had largely let her be. Her little shop, nestled between the blacksmith's forge and the equally ramshackle post office, soon became a fixture, its shelves neatly arrayed with glass jars containing meticulously labeled dried herbs, twisted roots, and pressed flowers. An apothecary, she named it, a term that sounded foreign and vaguely sophisticated to most. The more superstitious, however, particularly old Mother Hemlock, who claimed to see omens in everything from owl hoots to the patterns of dust devils, whispered less charitable descriptions in the dim corners of the general store. Abigail, it was undeniable, possessed a rare and intuitive skill with the flora of the region, an almost uncanny understanding of their hidden virtues and vices. She could brew a willow bark tea that would break a child's raging fever, fashion a comfort poultice to ease the tortured back of a ranch hand thrown by a Greenbrook colt, and her elderflower cordial, surprisingly light and fragrant, had become a quiet favorite at the infrequent town socials, though Abigail herself rarely graced these gatherings. Her hands, though seemingly delicate, moved with a deft, practiced sureness, whether she was grinding herbs with a heavy stone pestle and mortar or tending the surprisingly lush, orderly garden that flourished behind her cabin. This garden was her refuge, a small patch of cultivated beauty where the predictable cycles of growth and harvest seemed to offer a fragile bulwark against the ever-present uncertainties of frontier life. But Abigail Foster was more than just a gatherer of simples and a dispenser of herbal remedies. There was an almost preternatural stillness about her, a watchful quality that resided deep within her cool gray eyes. She missed very little. She registered the precise way Mayor Thompson's jovial smile consistently failed to warm his shrewd, calculating eyes. She'd observed the almost imperceptible tremor that afflicted young Timmy Evans' hand ever since his father's supposed accident at the Thompson-owned lumber mill, an incident that had conveniently cleared the way for Thompson to acquire more timber rights. She noted how Sheriff Ben Holloway, a man whose innate sense of decency was often visibly at war with his political debts, invariably seemed to acquiesce to the mayor's forcefully expressed opinions. Most particularly, she saw the undisguised avarice in Thompson's gaze whenever it fell upon the Fertile Creek lands adjoining her small property, land he had publicly and repeatedly declared essential for the future prosperity and expansion of Redemption Creek, and by clear implication his own. Her existence, quiet as it was on the surface, was subtly permeated by these undercurrents of ambition and unspoken tension. She had chosen Redemption Creek precisely for its remoteness, its seeming insignificance, hoping to finally lay to rest the turbulent past that had seared into her the brutal cost of unwanted attention and dangerous entanglements. Yet, even in this dusty outpost, true peace proved to be an elusive commodity. Sometimes she would find herself standing at her cabin window, gazing out at the distant, hazy line of the horizon, her posture unconsciously tensing, a familiar cold not forming in her stomach when a lone rider approached town too quickly, their purpose unreadable, or when the raucous din from the Rusty Spur saloon escalated into the sharp, ugly sounds of a brawl. These were not conscious anxieties, but ingrained reflexes, defensive instincts honed by forgotten trials, skills of minute observation and silent assessment that lay dormant, like embers, beneath the surface of her composure. The townsfolk saw a reserved woman tending her herbs, perhaps a little odd, a little aloof. They did not see the woman who could read the almost invisible signs of passage on a game trail, who understood the subtle shifts in the wind's direction that presaged a change in weather, or who could interpret the unspoken language of a sidelong glance or a too hearty laugh. This cultivated quietness was her armor, her most effective camouflage in a world that was often too quick to pass judgment, too eager to fear and condemn what it did not, or could not, comprehend. And Abigail understood, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in her marrow, that Mayor Thompson did not comprehend her at all, and what men like Thompson failed to understand, they often sought to dominate, or failing that, to destroy. The first distinct tremor of the coming earthquake, the initial sign that her carefully constructed anonymity was failing, arrived not with a bang, but with a series of small, unsettling incidents, like the furtive scuttling of a rat in the walls. Old Man Hemlock's prize-winning rooster, a magnificent bird whose clarion call faithfully heralded the dawn over Redemption Creek each morning, was discovered lifeless in its coop, without a single visible mark upon its feathered body, just unnaturally still. A week later, Martha Periwinkle, a widow known for her sharp tongue and her equally sharp cheese, found that her best milk cow, Bess, had inexplicably gone dry overnight. These were, on the surface, minor misfortunes, the kind of everyday setbacks that were part of the fabric of frontier existence. Yet Abigail, with her keen eye for patterns, noticed a disturbing common thread. Both Hemlock and Martha Periwinkle had, In recent town gatherings, vocally and vehemently opposed Mayor Thompson's latest ambitious project, a levy to fund the construction of a grand new town hall, a two-story clapboard edifice that many, including Hemlock and Periwinkle, deemed an extravagant waste when the saloon's spacious back room had served adequately for all official meetings. Then the insidious whispers began, spreading like a contagion through the dry tinder of the town's anxieties. They germinated in the shadowed corners of the general store, where townsfolk gathered for supplies and gossip, were cross-pollinated during the hushed exchanges at the weekly church social, and found particularly fertile ground in the fearful imaginations of the more credulous citizens. Abigail's carefully prepared poultices, once eagerly sought for sprains and bruises, were now regarded with a newfound, uneasy suspicion. Her meticulously gathered herbs, previously accepted as beneficial remedies, were now hinted to be the raw ingredients for something far less benign. Mayor Thompson, a man whose portly frame and florid complexion bespoke a life of comfortable indulgence, artfully fanned these nascent embers of doubt. A strange woman, that one, he would pronounce to any who would listen, his voice a carefully calibrated blend of feigned concern and civic responsibility, shaking his head with slow, ponderous gravity. Comes from nowhere, keeps to herself mostly, and these unusual concoctions she brews. One must exercise extreme caution for the good of the community. He took to standing across the dusty thoroughfare from her small apothecary shop, often for long stretches, his substantial arms crossed over his chest, his eyes, narrowed into judgmental slits, fixed upon her door. Abigail felt his gaze like a physical pressure, a silent, relentless accusation. He never confronted her directly, not in those early days. His preferred method was far more insidious, a slow, methodical poisoning of her character, a gradual erosion of her standing within the small, tightly knit community. She witnessed the subtle but undeniable shift in the demeanor of the townsfolk. Mrs. Gavel, a kind woman who had previously traded fresh-baked bread and a dozen eggs for Abigail's fragrant lavender sachets, now offered only a curt nod if their paths crossed, her face averted, her pace quickening. Young Billy Cooper, whose terrifying croup Abigail had eased through many a long winter night with her horehound syrup, was now abruptly snatched away by his anxious mother if he dared to venture too close to Abigail's herb garden. His childish curiosity met with a sharp, warning glance. Abigail maintained her quiet routines, her outward composure an unbroken facade of serene industry. She continued to tend her herbs with meticulous care, the familiar rhythm of planting, weeding, and harvesting a balm to her increasingly troubled spirit. She still offered her remedies to the dwindling few who, whether out of desperation or a lingering sense of loyalty, dared to seek her assistance. But inwardly, a cold, sharp vigilance had taken root and begun to grow. She became acutely aware of Mayor Thompson's closest associates, men like Jebediah Stone, a hulking, taciturn individual with a permanently sullen expression, and Walt Cooper, Billy's father, a man known for his weak will and mounting gambling debts, loitering with unnerving frequency near her cabin, often at odd hours, their presence both obvious and vaguely menacing. She would discover small, almost imperceptible disturbances around her property. A gate latch, which she knew with absolute certainty she had secured the previous evening, found mysteriously unfastened, a faint, unfamiliar boot print half hidden in the soft earth near her woodpile, a deliberate scattering of her carefully stacked kindling. These were not the clumsy, overt acts of intimidation one might expect. Instead, she sensed, they were a form of calculated surveillance, a subtle probing of her awareness, perhaps even a way of testing her nerve. Her quietness, her deliberate reserve, was not born of passivity. It was a finely honed instrument of observation, a shield forged in the fires of past adversities. She meticulously catalogued every furtive glance that skittered away when she met it, every hushed conversation that abruptly ceased upon her approach, every small, petty act of malice or ostracism. She knew, with an instinct that transcended mere suspicion, that Mayor Thompson was the unseen hand orchestrating this campaign, his motives likely a toxic blend of avarice for her land and a deeper, more personal animosity towards her independent, unreadable nature. The very air in Redemption Creek seemed to grow heavier, charged with unspoken accusations and a palpable, looming sense of dread. The initial disruption had passed. The siege, subtle but relentless, had truly begun. The insidious whispers soon congealed into the hard certainty of open suspicion, the turning point arriving with the sudden, grave illness of Jedediah Finch. Old Man Finch, as he was affectionately known, was a pillar of Redemption Creek, one of its original founding members, a man respected for his stubborn integrity and his equally stubborn adherence to the old ways. He had fallen ill with a racking cough and a burning fever, and with characteristic obstinacy, had refused all ministrations from Dr. Armitage, the town's nervous, newly arrived physician from back east, whose reliance on textbooks and unfamiliar instruments filled Finch with profound mistrust. Instead, in mounting desperation, Finch's devoted daughter, Mary, a gentle soul nearly undone with worry, had sought out Abigail. She had come to the small cabin by the creek, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping, her voice choked with unshed tears, begging, pleading for any remedy, any hope. Abigail, acutely aware of the dangerous currents swirling around her, of the precariousness of her own position, had nevertheless felt a surge of compassion. She had prepared a strong infusion of willow bark to combat the fever and a soothing lungwort decoction for the old man's congested chest. Remedies she had employed successfully countless times before, remedies as old as the hills themselves. She had given them to Mary with a heavy heart, cautioning her explicitly that Finch was exceedingly weak, that her herbs could only offer support and comfort, not perform miracles against the ravages of advanced age and severe illness. A mere day later, Jedediah Finch was dead. A profound, chilling silence descended upon Redemption Creek, a silence broken only by the raw, heartbroken sobs of Mary Finch and, soon after, by the resonant, authoritative voice of Mayor Augustus Thompson. He stood before the hastily convened and emotionally charged town meeting in the crowded, smoky confines of the Rusty Spur Saloon, his expression a carefully crafted mask of sorrow and righteous indignation. A tragedy, Thompson declared, his voice deep with feigned solemnity, his gaze sweeping over the assembled, anxious faces. A good man, a respected elder, struck down in his prime. And by what, I ask you? By whose hand? His eyes, heavy with potent implication, found Abigail, who stood silently, almost invisibly, at the very back of the packed room. Some say, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur that nevertheless carried to every corner, that he was administered certain potions by one who dabbles in things best left to the shadows, things not meant for God-fearing folk. The crowd stirred a low, guttural growl of agreement and dawning anger. Fear, amplified by grief, and now expertly seasoned with suspicion, swirled together into a dangerously volatile brew, all skillfully stirred by Thompson's inflammatory words. Abigail felt the collective weight of their stares, 100 pairs of eyes, accusing, hostile, searching for a target for their pain and confusion. She saw the flicker of doubt, the erosion of trust, even in the eyes of those she had previously helped, those who had once praised her skills. Sheriff Ben Holloway, a man whose conscience often seemed to be waging a losing battle against his political pragmatism and his undeniable reliance on Mayor Thompson's considerable financial and influential backing, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His gaze, when it finally, reluctantly, met Abigail's, was troubled, his brow furrowed. "Abigail," he said, his voice strained, hesitant. "Folks are saying, well, to be plain, Abigail, they're saying your remedies, they might have hastened Mr. Finch's unfortunate end. My remedies were intended only to ease his suffering, Sheriff," Abigail stated, her voice low but surprisingly clear, cutting through the sudden, expectant hush that had fallen over the saloon. "I made no promises of a cure, nor could I. Mr. Finch was a very old and a very sick man. But did you fully disclose to anyone at all, what precisely was in those drafts you provided? Mayor Thompson interjected smoothly, stepping forward, his bulk commanding the center of attention. These strange and exotic herbs you gather from who knows where. Perhaps some of them are not nearly as benign, not nearly as harmless, as they might appear. He was playing directly to their deepest fears, their ingrained suspicion of the unknown, their ignorance of the natural world she understood so intimately. Abigail's jaw tightened, an almost imperceptible clenching that only someone watching her with extreme focus might have noticed. She recognized Thompson's tactic instantly. He was laying a carefully baited trap. To enumerate the simple, common herbs she had used, willow, lungwort, would sound defensive, perhaps even desperate, in this charged atmosphere. To refuse to answer would only fuel their already inflamed suspicions, confirming their worst fears. She chose silence, her gaze steady, unwavering, fixed on the mayor's smug face. Her mind, however, was a maelstrom of activity. This was no accident, no unfortunate coincidence. Finch's death, and its timing, was far too convenient for Thompson. A cold, sickening certainty began to crystallize within her. Thompson, or more likely his loyal henchman, had somehow intervened, perhaps tampering with the remedies she had so carefully prepared for Mary, or even, more horrifyingly, administering something else entirely, something lethal. But she possessed no shred of proof, only this chilling intuition, this deep-seated conviction that she was being systematically framed. In the suffocating days that followed, the atmosphere in Redemption Creek became almost unbearable. Abigail found herself increasingly, chillingly, isolated. Her small apothecary shop remained shuttered, its windows dark and dusty, her carefully tended garden visited by no one but herself and the indifferent bees. She retreated into the sanctuary of her small cabin, her senses perpetually on high alert, every nerve ending raw and exposed. She knew, with a grim certainty, that Thompson would not stop with mere accusations. His campaign against her had entered a new, more dangerous phase. She began, with extreme caution, to gather what little information she could, observing the comings and goings in the town from the narrow vantage of her window, listening intently to the fragmented snatches of conversation that drifted on the prairie wind, conversations that often ceased abruptly if she was seen. She noted the late-night lights burning in Thompson's office at the land registry, the hushed, furtive exchanges between his known associates and certain townsfolk, individuals known for their loose tongues, their desperate need for few coins, or their slavish loyalty to the mayor. She saw Jebediah Stone, one of Thompson's most thuggish and devoted lackeys, emerging from the shadowy alley behind the general store late one evening, clutching a small, unlabeled packet, his eyes darting around nervously before he hurried off into the darkness. Her calm, quiet exterior remained an unbroken shield, but beneath it, her mind was a whirlwind of frantic calculation and desperate strategy as she tried to piece together the disparate, frightening fragments of a deadly puzzle being assembled around her. The strain was immense, a constant, grinding pressure, but her resolve, forged and tempered in the crucible of past trials she never spoke of, held firm, a sliver of hard steel within her. She was being hunted. She knew it in her bones, and the hunter, emboldened by his successes, was growing ever more audacious, preparing for the final, decisive move. The fragile dam of Abigail's composure finally broke on a stifling, breathless Tuesday morning, when the sun beat down on Redemption Creek with merciless intensity. Sheriff Holloway, his face a mask of grim reluctance, his eyes shadowed with an unease that spoke volumes, appeared at Abigail's cabin door. He was not alone. Flanking him, like two grim outriders of doom, stood Jebediah Stone and Walt Cooper, Thompson's ever-present enforcers, their expressions a mixture of grim satisfaction and barely concealed menace. "Abigail Foster," the sheriff began, his voice devoid of its usual gruff warmth, rough and strained. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Abigail's heart gave a single, painful lurch, as if struck by a physical blow, but her expression, when she looked up at him, remained astonishingly composed, her voice even. "On what charge, Sheriff?" "The murder of Jedediah Finch," Holloway stated, his gaze dropping from hers to fix on the dusty porch boards at her feet. He couldn't meet her eyes. Stone, however, allowed a cruel grin to spread across his unshaven face, a flash of yellowed teeth in his grimy beard. "Murder?" Abigail's voice was a low, incredulous breath, yet her eyes, sharp as flint and unwavering, bored into the sheriff's averted face. "That is a most serious accusation, Sheriff. On what grounds do you make it?" We found evidence," Holloway mumbled, gesturing vaguely, uncomfortably, towards the town. It was Mayor Thompson, his voice booming with self-important authority, who elaborated as he strode up the path behind them, his face alight with a look of grim, almost holy satisfaction. "Indeed, Sheriff, my men, in their commendable diligence and concern for public safety, undertook a thorough search of the area around the late Mr. Finch's home." "And what, pray tell, did they discover?" He paused for maximum dramatic effect, his eyes, gleaming with triumph, sweeping over Abigail. "A small pouch," Mayor Thompson continued, his voice resonating with conviction, "carelessly discarded, or perhaps hastily hidden, near Finch's woodpile. A pouch, madam, containing a rather potent and decidedly less common herb. An herb, I am reliably informed by our new and learned physician, Dr. Armitage, that after his careful examination of Mr. Finch's distressing symptoms prior to his unfortunate demise, could induce precisely the kind of swift and fatal decline that our dear Jedediah experienced. An herb, Abigail, that you are widely known to cultivate in that unusual little garden of yours." "Foxglove." A wave of icy understanding washed over Abigail. "Foxglove. Digitalis." She did indeed grow a small, carefully tended patch, for its acknowledged heart-regulating properties, to be used with extreme, almost reverential caution, and only in the most minute, precisely measured doses. But she had given none to Jedediah Finch, none at all. The pouch, the herb, it had been planted. Someone, Thompson, had orchestrated this, ensuring she would hang for a crime she did not commit. "That is a contemptible lie," Abigail said, her voice remarkably firm despite the violent tremor that coursed through her entire body. "I administered only willow bark and lungwort to Mr. Finch for his fever and his cough. Someone else, someone malicious, placed that pouch there." Thompson emitted a short, harsh chuckle, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "A likely story, madam, a most convenient fabrication. And who, I ask you, would do such a dastardly thing? Unless, of course, it was you yourself, attempting to rid yourself of the damning evidence once your dark deed was done." The trial was a grotesque mockery of justice, a cruel and hastily assembled piece of frontier theater, with Mayor Thompson acting as both prosecutor and chief puppeteer. It convened barely 3 days after her arrest, a period deliberately calculated to afford Abigail no opportunity to secure legal counsel from outside Redemption Creek, no chance to gather witnesses or prepare any semblance of a proper defense. The so-called new physician, Dr. Armitage, a nervous, sweating young man who looked barely old enough to shave, and who was clearly, painfully intimidated by Mayor Thompson's overbearing presence, testified in a quavering voice that Jedediah Finch's symptoms were entirely consistent with the significant overdose of digitalis, poisoning by foxglove. Mary Finch, her face pale and tear-streaked, consumed by grief and bewildered confusion, testified that Abigail had indeed given her father remedies, though she admitted under Thompson's leading questions that she could not say for certain what those remedies contained. Then came Jebediah Stone and Walt Cooper, Thompson's loyal cronies, who swore under solemn oath, their faces models of earnest sincerity, that they had discovered the incriminating pouch of dried foxglove leaves near Finch's woodpile, untouched by any hand but, presumably, Abigail's. Their testimonies were smooth, too smooth, flowing with an unnatural, rehearsed precision. The jury, a panel comprised of men who either owed significant debts to Mayor Thompson, feared his vindictive wrath, or were simply swayed by the tide of popular opinion he had so skillfully manufactured, listened with faces that were impassive, yet somehow already convinced. Abigail spoke in her own defense, her voice quiet but clear, her words carefully chosen, precise. She explained the simple, well-known herbs she had administered to Finch, herbs used for generations to treat such common ailments. She categorically denied any knowledge of the planted foxglove, any involvement in his death. She spoke of her small garden, not as a place of sinister secrets, but as a source of healing, of the profound and benevolent properties of plants when understood and used with knowledge, respect, and care. But her quiet sincerity, her reasoned pleas, were like whispers against a rising gale. They were no match for the overwhelming tide of fear, prejudice, and hysteria that Thompson had so masterfully unleashed upon the town. He painted her as a dangerous outsider, an enigmatic woman dabbling in arcane and potentially malevolent arts, an insidious threat to the good, simple, God-fearing folk of Redemption Creek. He skillfully reminded them of the unexplained livestock deaths, the persistent, unsettling whispers, the vague but pervasive unease she had inadvertently brought with her to their community. She watched their faces, the 12 men in the jury box, the townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder in the sweltering, airless courtroom. She saw fear, yes, stark and undeniable, but she also saw something else, something uglier, a grim, almost eager satisfaction. They had found their scapegoat. They had found someone upon whom to unload the burden of their anxieties, their hardships, their grief. They had found a convenient vessel for all the unexplained misfortunes and the simmering frustrations of their difficult frontier lives. Her heart ached, not merely for her own impending doom, but for their profound, self-imposed blindness, for their eagerness to condemn. The deliberation was insultingly short, far too short for any genuine consideration of the facts, for any wrestling with conscience. When the jury foreman, a burly, soot-stained blacksmith named Silas Blackwood, a man whose failing forge Thompson had recently and very publicly saved from foreclosure with a timely and generous loan, stood to deliver the verdict, Abigail already knew its content. His eyes, hard and opaque as the cold iron he hammered daily, deliberately refused to meet hers. Guilty. The word, when it finally came, was like a physical blow, a sledgehammer striking her chest, driving the very breath from her lungs. The courtroom erupted in a low, sibilant murmur, a complex tapestry of grim approval, nervous relief, and perhaps, for a few, a dawning, uncomfortable shame. Abigail drew herself up straighter, her hands clasped tightly before her, a single, hot tear escaping to trace a solitary path through the fine layer of dust on her cheek. She had faced death before, in a distant, shadowy past she had fought so hard to bury. But not like this. Never like this. Not for a crime she had not committed, condemned by the very people she had tried, in her own quiet, unassuming way, to help. The shadow of the noose, no longer a vague threat, loomed dark, palpable, and terrifyingly inescapable. Judge Hargrove, his face now ashen and beaded with perspiration, fumbled with the papers on his bench. He glanced at Abigail, a fleeting, hunted look in his eyes. Was it pity? Or perhaps a desperate, last-minute flicker of doubt? Quickly and deliberately extinguished. He was a man caught in a powerful current, too weak, too compromised, to swim against it. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud, almost explosive, in the suddenly tense, expectant silence. Abigail Foster, he began again, his voice hoarse, raspy, as if dragged over stones, having been found guilty of the heinous murder of Jedediah Finch by a jury of your peers. This court finds it has no alternative but to sentence you. He paused, visibly struggling, taking a shallow, ragged breath. To be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May God, in his infinite wisdom, have mercy upon your soul. A collective, sharp intake of breath went through the entire room, like a wind sighing through dry reeds, followed immediately by a rising wave of hushed, almost excited chatter. Mayor Thompson, standing near the prosecution table, allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly triumphant smirk. Abigail closed her eyes for a brief moment, a silent prayer, or perhaps a final, sorrowful farewell, passing her lips. The oppressive heat, the cloying smell of unwashed bodies and raw, undisguised fear, the crushing, unbearable weight of this monstrous injustice, it was all-consuming, a suffocating blanket. This was it then, her carefully constructed quiet life in Redemption Creek, her fragile, desperate hope for a small measure of peace, of belonging, was to end here, ignominiously, at the end of a rough hemp rope. Then came the shattering crash. The courtroom doors, formidable planks of seasoned oak, splintered and burst inward, as if struck by a thunderbolt, or a battering ram wielded by giants. Silence, sudden, absolute, and shocking, descended upon the room like a physical blow. Every eye, wide with disbelief and dawning alarm, turned towards the ruined doorway. Harsh, unforgiving sunlight poured into the dim courtroom, silhouetting a figure standing defiantly in the breach. He was tall, lean as a desert wolf, radiating an aura of coiled, untamed power and the vast, indifferent wilderness from which he had emerged. His black hair, long and unbound, streamed behind him as if caught in its own wind, framing a face that was all stark angles, high cheekbones, and watchful, predatory intensity. A beautifully crafted rifle, adorned with intricate carvings, was slung across his powerful back, and a cold peacemaker, its wooden grip worn smooth with use, rested low and easy on his hip. Kéyah. The name itself was a living legend, a whisper freighted with fear and a grudging, almost mythical respect among settlers, soldiers, and even other tribes. He was a renowned leader among the fiercely independent Dine bands who refused the indignity of reservation life, a warrior who knew the labyrinthine canyons and sun-scorched mesas of the territory as intimately as he knew the lines on his own hand. He moved with the fluid, silent grace of a stalking mountain cat, his soft-soled moccasins making absolutely no sound on the rough-hewn wooden floorboards as he advanced purposefully into the very center of the stunned room. His dark, penetrating eyes, missing nothing, swept over the assembly of frozen faces, the judge, his mouth still agape, his sentence unfinished, the jury, their expressions a comical mixture of terror and disbelief, Mayor Thompson, his smug smirk instantly wiped away, replaced by a look of utter astonishment and dawning, sickening apprehension. Finally, Kéyah's intense gaze came to rest on Abigail, who stood rigidly by the defendant's rail, her own profound shock warring with a sudden, inexplicable flicker of something akin to recognition? Hope. It was too soon to tell. He halted a mere few feet from the judge's imposing bench, his very presence seeming to alter the atmosphere in the room, charging it with a volatile, electric tension. Sheriff Holloway, reacting on pure instinct, made a hesitant, aborted movement towards his holstered sidearm, then froze, his hand hovering uselessly, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Kéyah ignored him completely, as if he were no more significant than a piece of furniture. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, yet it possessed a deep, resonant timbre that carried effortlessly to every corner of the courthouse, imbued with an undeniable, almost chilling authority. This woman, he declared, is strong, buckskin-clad arm gesturing almost dismissively towards Abigail. You will not harm her. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hargrove, visibly shaken, finally found his voice, though it quavered noticeably. And who are you, sir, to so brazenly disrupt these solemn proceedings? This is a court of law, I'll have you know. This is civilized territory. Kéyah's lips, thin and firm, curled into a humorless, almost predatory smile. I am Kéyah, and your particular brand of law, it seems, does not extend to her in this specific matter. He paused, allowing the full weight of his words and his presence to sink into the stunned silence. She is Náhookos. The unfamiliar Navajo word, spoken with such conviction, sounded strange, alien, almost mystical in the dusty, mundane confines of the Western courtroom. It hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "She is sacred to my people," Kéyah continued, his voice gaining strength. "Protected by the Deen Daini, the holy people themselves. To harm her, to spill her blood on this land, is to invite a deep and abiding shadow upon your own lodges, a wasting sickness upon your children, a devastating blight upon your crops, and your land that no prayer of yours, no medicine of your white doctors, will ever lift." The courtroom buzzed with a confused, fearful cacophony of murmurs. "Sacred? This quiet, unassuming herb woman?" Mayor Thompson, his face mottling with anger and a rising tide of fear, began to recover his bluster. He pushed himself forward, jabbing a thick finger in Kéyah's direction. "Now see here, you insolent savage. This is utter nonsense. Superstitious drivel. She is a convicted murderer, found guilty by a lawful, God-fearing jury. Your primitive tribal superstitions and heathen claims mean absolutely nothing in this place of justice." Kéyah's eyes, as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm sweeping across the high plains, fixed on Thompson, pinning him like an insect. "Your so-called lawful jury, little chief, was bought and paid for with fear, intimidation, and blatant lies. My people, the Dine, see much from the high mesas that overlook your small, noisy town. We see the coyote slink in the darkness of night. We see the rattlesnake shed its old skin to reveal a new, more venomous one beneath." His gaze flickered pointedly towards Jebediah Stone and Walt Cooper, who visibly paled and shrank back under his scrutiny. "We saw your paid men, Thompson, plant the bundle of false evidence near the old one's dwelling, under the cloak of twilight. We saw them meet with you in the deep darkness, long before the first light of dawn touched the sky, their whispers carrying on the still night air. A wave of shocked gasps and horrified murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Heads, one by one, turned towards Mayor Thompson, whose florid, self-satisfied face was now rapidly becoming a mask of mottled purple and sickly gray. "Lies! All brazen lies from a wanted outlaw, a horse thief," he sputtered, his voice cracking, losing its confident timbre. "He's trying to save his own skin, or hers. Is it a lie?" Kéyah countered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch, yet remaining perfectly calm, utterly cutting. "Náhookos, the one you seek to unjustly kill, bears a mark, a sacred sign, bestowed upon her by the Star People when the world was younger. Long, long ago, when she was but a girl, no older than my own daughter, journeying with her family through lands far distant from this place, lands that were then wild and untamed. They were brutally set upon by white raiders. All were lost, slaughtered without mercy, save her. She alone survived, wounded, terrified, and wandered, lost and bleeding, into our ancestral territory. An old grandmother of my own clan, a revered seer, a woman touched by the spirits, found her near the brink of death, hidden amongst the sacred junipers. She tended the girl's wounds, saw the bright, unbroken spirit that burned fiercely within her despite her terrible hurts, saw the way the child's frightened eyes constantly followed the North Star, Náhookos, the star that never moves, for guidance, for solace, through the long, cold nights. The grandmother, wise in the ways of the holy people, declared her touched by the spirits, a bridge between the worlds of man and the sacred mysteries. She carries a token from that time, a small, intricately carved piece of sacred turquoise, shaped like the very star she watched with such unwavering faith." He turned his intense gaze directly upon Abigail, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Show them, Náhookos. Show them the truth you carry." Abigail's hand, trembling uncontrollably now, flew to her throat. Hidden there, tucked securely beneath the modest, high collar of her worn calico dress, suspended on a thin, aged leather thong, was indeed a small, beautifully carved turquoise pendant. It was shaped like a star, with 4 distinct points, its surface worn smooth by time and touch. She had worn it for as long as she could remember, a solitary, enigmatic relic from a past almost entirely erased from her conscious mind by overwhelming trauma and loss, its true origin, its profound significance, a complete mystery even to her until this very moment. With fumbling fingers, she drew it out, holding it aloft in her trembling palm. The ancient turquoise, veined with black matrix, gleamed with a soft, ethereal blue-green light in the dim, dusty courtroom. A collective murmur of profound awe, of stunned disbelief and dawning wonder, swept through the room. It was one thing to hear a notorious outlaw's wild, improbable claim. It was quite another to see such tangible, unexpected, and undeniably beautiful proof. Thompson, desperate now, scoffed loudly, trying to break the spell. A mere trinket, a piece of Indian jewelry. That proves absolutely nothing. She's a witch, I tell you. A cunning charlatan who has bewitched this savage. She, the old one, Finch, Kéyah interrupted again, his voice once more like the distant roll of thunder, sharp and authoritative, cutting through Thompson's frantic bluster. He did not die from her herbs, nor from any witchcraft. He died from a heart that was old and weak. Yes, that much is true. But his passing was cruelly hastened by a bitter powder, a poison, secretly mixed into his last cup of water by a man who owed you, Mayor Thompson, a very great deal of money. A man seen by one of my young hunters, whose eyes are as keen as the eagle's, skulking away from Finch's back door in the pre-dawn gloom, his shoulders hunched, his steps furtive. A man Thompson named Walt Cooper. Walt Cooper, the weaker of Thompson's two main cronies, the one who had testified with such smooth, rehearsed conviction about finding the planted herbs, let out a choked, strangled cry and stumbled backward as if physically struck, his face instantly becoming a ghastly, ashen white. No, he's lying. It ain't true. It's a damn Navajo lie. But his terror was palpable, a radiating wave of guilt and fear that filled the courtroom. Every eye in that suddenly silent, charged room swung towards him, then, with dawning, horrified comprehension, towards Mayor Thompson, whose carefully constructed facade of righteous indignation was visibly, catastrophically, crumbling. Sheriff Ben Holloway, finally, decisively spurred to action by something other than Mayor Thompson's insidious influence, by the raw, undeniable power of Kéyah's presence and the damning evidence of Cooper's reaction, stepped forward. His hand now rested firmly, confidently, on the butt of his Colt, his gaze hard and unwavering as it fixed on the terrified Cooper. Walt, is this true? Did you go to Jedediah Finch's place on the night he died? Did you give him anything? Cooper stammered, his eyes darting desperately, pleadingly, towards Thompson, who now studiously, pointedly, avoided his gaze, his own face a mask of feigned indifference that fooled no one. I was just checking on him, Sheriff, sir. Just like the mayor asked me to. Just to see if he needed anything. Like the mayor asked you to do what, Cooper? Kéyah pressed, his voice relentless, cold as ice, offering no escape. To ensure the old man drank his special water? To make sure he wouldn't trouble your master any longer? Under the combined, crushing pressure of Kéyah's unwavering, accusatory stare, the sheriff's grim determination, and the suddenly hostile, accusing eyes of the entire assembled townsfolk, Walt Cooper finally, spectacularly broke. He said Finch was suffering something awful, that it'd be a mercy to help him along. He said Abigail's strange herbs were probably poison anyway, that this would just speed things along and make it look like it was her doing. His confession tumbled out, a torrent of desperate words fueled by raw fear and overwhelming guilt. Thompson made me do it. He threatened to call in all my gambling debts, to ruin me, to see my family out on the street. He promised me a share of the profits from Finch's land once it was sold. The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of outrage. Shouts of liar and murderer and string him up were now directed not at the stunned and silent Abigail, but at a visibly deflating, terrified Mayor Augustus Thompson. Judge Hargrove, his face a bewildered mixture of shock, dawning comprehension, and perhaps a touch of shame at his own earlier compliance, hammered his gavel with renewed, desperate vigor. Order! Order! Order in this court! Thompson, his face now slick with sweat, his eyes wide with panic, tried to rally, to deny, to bluster his way out, but his voice was utterly drowned out by the rising tide of righteous fury emanating from the crowd. They had been manipulated, lied to, their fears and prejudices callously exploited to condemn an innocent woman and to conceal a cold-blooded, calculated murder. The supposedly helpless town, as Thompson had so contemptuously viewed them, now possessed a furious, unified strength. Several large, angry men, their faces dark with retribution, surged forward, intent on dragging Thompson from the courtroom themselves. Sheriff Holloway, for once acting with swift, decisive authority, his own integrity seemingly reawakened, moved quickly to apprehend not Abigail Foster, but a spluttering, whimpering, utterly broken Mayor Thompson. Marcus Augustus Thompson, the sheriff declared, his voice ringing with a newfound and surprising conviction that echoed through the suddenly quieted room. You are under arrest for the murder of Jedediah Finch and for conspiring to pervert the sacred course of justice in this town. Jebediah Stone, seeing his powerful employer's sudden and dramatic downfall, attempted to slip unnoticed through the enraged crowd and escape through the shattered doorway. But he was quickly spotted and seized by several grim-faced townsfolk, his struggles futile against their combined anger. The tide had turned, with the shocking, dramatic suddenness of a flash flood in a dry desert canyon. It had turned irrevocably. Abigail watched, her hand still clutching the warm, smooth turquoise star, as the man who had so systematically, so cruelly, tried to destroy her was ignominiously led away, his power broken, his reign of deceit and intimidation shattered. Kéyah had not moved from his spot in the center of the room, his expression unreadable, impassive, as he observed the swift, chaotic unraveling of Thompson's carefully woven web of lies. Justice, raw, immediate, and utterly unexpected, had arrived in Redemption Creek, not on the back of the established law as it was written and often manipulated, but through the startling, courageous intervention of a feared outlaw and the dramatic, last-minute emergence of a deeply hidden, almost forgotten truth. The very air in the courtroom, moments before thick with the stench of condemnation and impending death, now thrummed with a wild, almost cathartic energy, a sense of profound, if unsettling, liberation. The noose that had so recently, so terrifyingly, awaited Abigail Foster now figuratively, and perhaps very soon literally, awaited another. In the chaotic, emotionally charged aftermath, as Mayor Thompson and his thoroughly discredited henchmen, Stone and Cooper, were securely confined in the town's small, newly reinforced jail, Kéyah finally turned his intense gaze back to Abigail. His dark eyes, which had moments before flashed with righteous anger and cold authority, now held a different quality, a depth of understanding and perhaps even a flicker of shared history that she was only just beginning to comprehend. "Náhookos," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle, yet still carrying its inherent resonance. "The path ahead of you is now clear. It is yours to choose, to walk as you see fit. My people will know that you are safe, that the shadow has passed from you. The story of this day, of your vindication, will travel with the four winds across the mesas and through the canyons." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that spoke of profound respect, perhaps even a recognition of an ancient, unspoken kinship. And then, as silently, as suddenly, and as mysteriously as he had appeared, he was gone. He seemed to melt back into the still stunned and murmuring crowd, and out through the shattered remnants of the courtroom doors, vanishing into the vast, indifferent expanse of the frontier, as if he were not a man of flesh and blood at all, but a spirit of the land itself, a fleeting manifestation of its wild, untamable heart. The small, shaken town of Redemption Creek was left to grapple with the astonishing, almost unbelievable events of that fateful day. The charges against Abigail Foster were immediately, unceremoniously, dropped. the guilty verdict summarily overturned amidst a flurry of heartfelt apologies, embarrassed retractions, and expressions of profound, shocked disbelief from townsfolk still reeling from the revelations. Mayor Thompson's dramatic exposure and the subsequent confessions of his accomplices sent deep, unsettling ripples through the entire community. His corruption, it soon became clear, had run far deeper, his manipulative influence touching nearly every aspect of town life, from land deals to business licenses. In the days and weeks that followed, a new council of respected town elders, including a humbled and much wiser Judge Hargrove, was hastily formed to manage Redemption Creek's affairs, their primary, publicly stated goal to root out any remaining vestiges of Thompson's cronyism and to restore a measure of trust and decency to their governance. Abigail found herself the subject of a new kind of attention, a mixture of awe, profound respect, and a lingering, wary curiosity. She was no longer merely the quiet, enigmatic herb woman, nor the falsely accused, suspected witch. She was Náhookos, the woman an outlaw had claimed as sacred, the woman a feared Navajo warrior had risked his own freedom, perhaps even his life, to save from an unjust fate. Some townsfolk, particularly the more timid or superstitious, still kept their distance, unnerved by the almost mystical aura that now seemed to cling to her, by the undeniable power that had so dramatically intervened on her behalf. But many others, like a tearfully repentant Mary Finch, approached her with open expressions of gratitude, offering sincere apologies for their earlier doubts and extending tentative gestures of friendship. Mrs. Gavel, her face etched with shame and remorse, resumed her weekly deliveries of fresh eggs and warm bread, often adding a small pot of honey or a jar of preserves as a silent token of her regret. Young Billy Cooper, whose father now languished in jail, would wave shyly, a look of childish wonder in his eyes, whenever he saw Abigail tending her garden. Abigail slowly, cautiously, resumed her life, but it was irrevocably different now. The crushing weight of the gallows, the suffocating fear of imminent death, had been lifted, but it was replaced by a strange, almost unsettling sense of destiny, of a life no longer entirely her own. The turquoise pendant, no longer just a forgotten, meaningless trinket from a nebulous past, became a constant, tangible reminder of a profound connection she hadn't known she possessed, a deep and abiding link to the ancient spirits of the land, to a proud and resilient people who saw far more in her than just another settler woman. Her characteristic quietness remained, her natural reserve unchanged, but it was now imbued with a different quality, a serene, unshakable strength that came from having survived not just the inherent harshness of the frontier, but the calculated treachery of men, and from having glimpsed a truth far older and more powerful than their petty ambitions. She continued to tend her flourishing herb garden, her deep knowledge of plants and their healing properties now viewed with a new, almost reverential respect by the townsfolk. She rarely spoke of Kéyah, or of the specific, miraculous events that had transpired in the courtroom that day, allowing the legend, as such things do, to grow and transform on its own, whispered around campfires and in the hushed corners of the general store. Redemption Creek, through its ordeal, had been forced to look deeply into its own collective heart, to confront its own capacity for fear, for prejudice, and for terrible injustice. It was a harsh and bitter lesson, learned perilously close to the brink of a fatal, unforgivable mistake. Abigail Foster, the woman they had almost hanged, the woman now known to some as Náhookos, became a quiet, respected, and somewhat enigmatic fixture in the slowly healing town. She never knew if she would ever see Kéyah again, if their paths would ever cross in the vast, unpredictable tapestry of the West. But often, in the quiet hours of dusk or dawn, she would find her gaze drifting towards the distant, purple-shadowed mesas, towards the wild, untamed lands that had sent forth such an unlikely, unforgettable savior. She had come to Redemption Creek seeking only peace and the shield of anonymity, and instead, she had found a harrowing trial by fire, an astonishingly unveiled past, and an unexpected, profoundly resonant connection to the rugged, indomitable spirit of the untamed West. And in that unforeseen journey, she found a deeper, more resilient, and far more meaningful peace than she had ever dared to imagine possible. The trail dust had settled for now, revealing a hard-won, immutable truth, a testament to courage, justice, and the enduring mysteries of the human heart.